there is an Obama administration person who we did battle with for years and years, and he's quoted in one of the major publications here in DC saying, "The Stewart Mafia is real, and its tentacles are everywhere." I'm like,
oh, you got to get a T-shirt with that on it.
I will.
Mornings are better with a warm beverage, even for Latter-day Saints. Meet Postum, the ideal coffee alternative and proud sponsor of This Week in Mormons podcast. Spotted on the coffee aisle at Smith's Grocery or at your local nearby store. Can't locate it? No worries. Order it at postum.com. Explore delicious recipes to tailor your Postum experience. Start your day off right with Postum.
Welcome, everybody, to This Week in Mormons with Matt and Melissa. Today, we are joined by our very special guest, Tim Stewart. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
It's good to be with you guys. Sure. My name is Tim Stewart. Matt and I have known each other for a while.
Yeah.
I used to make fun of him while he was called upon to lead the music in sacrament meeting at the very last minute.
Oh, I bet that was entertaining. Yeah.
Good times.
Yeah.
But for professional purposes, I'm a principal and a founder of two DC-based lobbying and consulting firms, American Capital Group and the Bennett Group. And I'm the president of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association here in Washington, D.C. I split my time between D.C. and Logan, Utah. We moved our family back out to Utah after 30 years in the D.C. area during COVID. And I make the weekly commute, just like a member of Congress. So that's...
Well, yeah, I noticed you're wearing the Utah State shirt. Way to represent.
Because we're Aggie Blue and the church is true, as we like to sing in Logan.
That's exactly right. From Cache Valley, too. Yes, that's right. It's a much more true church in Cache Valley than it is in, say, BYU Provo territory, don't you think?
Well, I don't know. I never go down there, so...
Yeah, why would you? Why would you?
That's right. I don't go south of the airport, to be honest with you. So.
So, Tim, a lot of our listeners have no idea what a lobbyist is. I think most of them think that lobbyist is like a dirty word. I actually have students that think lobbying is like this dirty, filthy industry. I try to tell them that it's not. I imagine that you feel like you do good in the world, that you don't just go around doing naughty things all the time. Like,
okay.
I kind of like to think that myself, actually, yeah.
That brings up one really important question that I wanted to ask Tim, though. As a lobbyist, do you pay money to people and ask them to commit crimes on your behalf?
Absolutely.
Is that your job?
Yeah, that's all in the job description.
Okay, thank you.
She asked Google what questions to ask a lobbyist, and that's what came up.
That was the first one that came up. So,
No, it's the easiest way to describe it, and there's a story behind it. When I found myself in a McDonald's somewhere in the middle of central Illinois on a Saturday morning on one of those cross-country drives that we were doing as a family. And I was wearing a Utah State shirt, and one of the old farmers asked what I was doing. I said, "We're driving cross country," and we started to have this conversation. And he asked what I did, and I thought, if I say I'm a lobbyist, I'm going to get beaten up. And I said, "So I fight the government all day long." And he said, "That's excellent. That's exactly what we need more of." And that's really what it is. From a lobbyist, what we do is we essentially are the last line of defense between a government that oftentimes is unchecked and a representative Congress, which tries to be representative of the people. But we actually, more than anything, we're like commodities brokers, except for instead of trading soybeans or pork bellies, we move information from place to place, and we do our best to help decision makers actually make good decisions. The biggest commodity in Washington is dumb decisions, and that is moving mass amounts. So that's what we try and do, is try and fix that. So how's that for an answer?
Yeah, that actually was a really good explanation for someone like me who really honestly has no idea. So when you say we, you're the head of a lobbying group or a lobbying company?
Yeah, there are about 30,000 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Virtually everything that we do, since everything that we do from the second we wake up to the morning to the second we go to bed at night is impacted by a government decision. Those 30,000 lobbyists and the associations that they represent, or the companies or the clients or what have you, our responsibility is to make sure that the decisions that a bureaucracy makes or a member of Congress or a president makes does so at least in an informed way. And
Hmm.
so, we woke up probably to our alarm clock on our phone, phone, that's the American telecommunications, powered by electricity, which was created by either oil and gas or nuclear or renewable, et cetera, et cetera. The clothes we're wearing, the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, virtually everything that we do has impact by government regulation. Therefore, it needs to be represented by somebody. And that's really what it is.
Okay. And how do you decide what position you're representing or what information needs to be passed along?
Well, whoever pays us the absolute most money, that's how I make decisions. That's,
Perfect.
So it's different, the way the industry is structured. You have people who, what you would call an in-house lobbyist. It might be for a company or an association or a nonprofit or something like that. And then you have a group of lobbyists like myself who are basically, we work for a number of different clients based on our subject matter experts and things like that. So in our firms, we have about 60 clients that we work for, and it's from everybody from the American Dental Association to the Walton Foundation and in between, both sides,
Okay.
Republican and Democrats, liberal and conservative causes. What we found is that the folks that we work with, the people who are in my firm, who come from both sides of the aisle, um, we have this ability, I think, to the whole purpose is to reach a consensus. Lobbyists aren't any really different than the theoretical member of Congress, which is you make a decision by reaching a consensus. And so
Okay.
that's how we do it. We find that it's very interesting. You might have Trout Unlimited and an oil and gas company who are actually on the same page on a conservation issue, for example. And so we make the decision based on, one, how if we're good at if we understand or we're good at the issue, we can't go in and just sort of BS our way around, although some people try and do that. We actually, if we are relatively smart about the issue, that makes us the ability to do it. But and if it's a good cause, there's a lot of clients we've turned away. For example,
Okay.
we just didn't want to work with them. We didn't believe in the cause. The money didn't matter to us. It doesn't matter if you make a lot of money if you sell your soul in the process, and that's where we try and keep our soul in this business.
Yeah. Interesting.
So there are a lot of people that ask the question like, what can I do to get more involved in politics? Or what can I do to make a difference in my community? And typically the answer they get is you could vote, you could run for office, or you could write a letter or an email to your member of Congress. But nobody ever says you could lobby the government. But Tim, I'm thinking that you've had a lot of influence on policy in your life as a lobbyist.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, at that level, obviously, uh, you need to sort of, again, it's the cast of thousands versus being aligned with the people who can actually help move the needle on something. I tell people if you want to be involved in politics, you have to be involved locally. That's the most important thing. Nobody wants to sit on the planning commission because it's a miserable experience. That's one of the most important things. You know, the sidewalk that North Logan City is building in front of my house at some point this summer is going to have a much bigger impact on me than anything else, at least in the short term. I tell people, look, if you really want to be involved and see how it works, and you want to figure out how to develop a consensus, go sit on the planning commission or the planning board or try and run for city council or something like that. Has a
Hmm.
much bigger impact on people, I think.
Interesting. So when you say, like we try to get stuff done, would it be too much to ask, like, tell me what your day because you're in DC right now,
Yeah.
what does a day in the life of you look like? Like, what does it mean you're trying to get stuff done?
Well, a typical day like something this week. I'm wearing probably on any given time of day, I'm wearing probably 5 or 6 different hats. I'll literally do this all day long. You kind of live your life in 15 to 20 minute increments. Every
Okay.
half hour, you're changing something. So today, for example, if I were to work backwards, I'll do this and wrap up. But before that, I was on a phone call with a client of ours who has a transit issue out in Utah. Okay, take that hat off and put another hat on. And I was doing some oil and gas work for a client who manages oil field waste and needs to figure out if there's a potential for a tax credit so the companies will be incentivized to use more of this type of technology. Take that hat off, and I was talking with some Capitol Hill staff just about politics and things like that. On, like I say, on any given day, I can start off, and our days are actually pretty long because you guys probably see this as well. There's no more sort of 9 to 5 job anymore.
So another question I have, Tim, is like in the like primary election process, the whole, because in Utah right now there's people vying for Mitt Romney's seat. There's various primary elections going on. Do lobbyists play any role in trying to make sure that some people win those primaries and other people don't win those primaries? Is that something that's also part of what you do?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're a straight out lobbyist, it's probably in your best interest not to get too involved in the actual campaign part themselves because that can come back and bite you. And so I try and be very careful about that. For the straight line lobbyists, the biggest participation we have in campaigns is helping an incumbent or somebody that you're supporting raise money. And you do that among it's like anything else. It's like a small business. You raise among family and friends first, right?
Mhm.
And so if you have somebody who you have great affinity for who have not been elected yet, a lot of times, and it's for the federal level, you'll bring them back and you'll work your friends over and some other associates to get them some initial seed money, some support. A lot of folks don't really want to get involved until after the primary. Again, the smart associations and the smart lobbyists just kind of lay low because they'll support. They don't want to have to get in a food fight because you don't want to be on the opposite side of somebody. You don't want to raise $1 million against somebody who
Wins.
loses or
Yeah,
wins
yeah,
and then looks at you.
yeah.
Uh, but there are some folks who are hybrid. They're lobbyists and consultants based on their campaign background, and some of them do. But interesting enough, lobbyists like myself, federal lobbyists don't focus much on the candidate as they do on the issue. Okay, does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So if I put on my oil and gas hat, uh, I raise and run public relations campaigns that have a tendency to focus on campaigns who of members who are either supportive or not supportive, and that's where actually the real participation lies is our ability to push out on behalf of the U.S. Oil and Gas Association a message that fossil energy is crucial to all of our life. And if I've got a member who has been very, very supportive of the industry as a whole, then yeah, we line up against them, or again, I will line up with them. And if there's a member who has made uh, every single effort to put us out of business, obviously we'll line up support for their opponent. So it's on the fundraising side. The interesting thing is everybody talks about how much money there is in politics.
Yeah.
So Matt, you ought to have your class run an interesting simulation. Figure out how much we spend on campaigns every year, then figure out how much we spend on things like stairs for dogs, yeah, or pet food and things like that. You'll find it's actually multitudes much higher on just a typical consumer product than we do on campaigns. So,
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think the numbers is something like $6 billion that gets raised in a typical campaign in total, but
mhm,
the federal budget is in the trillions of dollars.
yeah, yeah.
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 But
You
what
know, the
about
NFL is bigger in terms of revenue than all of the political activities in the United States combined.
but that's
One,
only because Taylor Swift is dating Travis
yeah,
Kelce.
that's true.
Everybody
That's
knows
true.
the NFL wasn't
Yeah.
anything before
No, but
that.
it is. The NFL is a $13 billion year enterprise. That's twice the size of all of the politics that we have. So when you say there's too much money in politics, well, if you say that there's too much money in a lot of other things as well, or there's not enough money in politics, you can make that
Yeah.
argument both ways. So,
But what about people who hear this and feel like, okay, but to me, that means like if I don't have money, I can't actually get anybody to fight for my causes. Like it sounds like you have to have money to actually be able to have influence.
well, yes and no. Okay. That influence is wielded by let's use an association or not nonprofit. Okay, let's say that you are interested in conservation issues, and so you join the League of Conservation Voters or the Sierra Club or Audubon, for example. Let's say you're a purple haired lady from from Rexburg and you love birds, and so you join the Audubon Society and you give $20. Okay, well, that
Okay.
$20 is then aggregated across 4 million other people, and all of a sudden you don't have $20; you've got $80 million, for example, in an NGO. and that's how that's used. And so it's not as if you have to hire a lobbyist to solve a problem, but you have to affiliate with enough people who are like-minded, and then it's amazing how many problems can either be resolved or extended, as the case may be, whatever you want to do. And that's kind of my argument back, which is you actually have far more leverage than you think that you do, because that's the purpose of a trade association, is to aggregate the support of all the small people under one umbrella and one unified message.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense actually. Because yeah, I'm a member of, professional organizations or, a lot of things like that, like you're talking about. And I didn't ever really think about how like paying that association due or even just going to meetings and having my voice heard in those smaller, groups that I do associate with is making the difference on a big scale. So yeah, that's a really interesting and good perspective. So that
Yeah.
makes sense to me. Yeah.
And I appreciate it. So, like, using the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, I've got 300 paying members, and I've got about more than half of those are just small mom and pop companies who have 3 or 4 employees. They're very, very small businesses. They may have one or two producing wells, and they pay $500. And compared to a multinational company over here, who happens to be another one of my members over here. And so we run the spectrum. But the fact of the matter is that that one small family company is getting represented on the same issue as the great big company as well, because it's all one
Hmm.
and the same.
Yeah.
So,
Very interesting.
So I'm going to use this question to kind of transition into more like biographical stuff, Tim. But we had John Curtis on a while back, and we talked with him about how he uses his position as a member of Congress sometimes to advocate for things that are helpful to the church. Do you have similar kinds of stories or experiences you can share as a lobbyist in Washington D.C. Things you've been able to do to help the church globally?
I mean, yeah, I sort of. And John's a great American.
Yeah.
John is exactly the type of person you want in Washington D.C. and globally representing the church. I mean, you want it to. He's kind of like my old boss, Senator Bennett. He's probably about as close to my old boss as Senator Bennett and anybody that member I worked with over the year, and I've worked with dozens of them. And it's this philosophy which is very gospel oriented, which is there are no. It goes back to the old Reagan world. Reagan saying of there's no such thing as an enemy. There's just a friend and a potential friend. The thing about John Curtis, I've always noticed, again, similar to Bob Bennett, was that we can disagree vehemently on a policy issue, but that does not make you an enemy of mine. And the fact of the matter is if I'm smart and you're smart, you and I'll work together on something completely different 2 years from now. So why hate each other now when we can potentially be friends and work on something else? And
Mm.
that's the gospel principle, right? Love everybody, love your neighbor as yourself. And from my perspective, you guys, from a lobbyist, the only real thing that we have, the only tangible asset that we have is our reputation. Okay. And what that's what I've learned is people probably like having me around, but the second that I walk out the door, I know that somebody's saying to somebody else, he's a Mormon, right? And if they say, yeah, yeah, that's and they say, but he seems like a good guy. Yeah, that's exactly what you want.
Right.
And I got an example for you. It's really interesting. Actually, it sits right here. I'm going to show this to you. Okay, you probably never had this on your podcast before. This is a cigar.
We have not had one of
Oh,
those.
I thought it was a Kit Kat bar.
Yeah,
Okay, go
no,
on.
this cigar is 27 years old. Okay.
Wow.
And there's a story behind it, which is I was working on Capitol Hill. I was in the Senate, and I had an acquaintance. He wasn't a friend, he was just an acquaintance who was a lobbyist. And our first daughter was born. And it was on April 15th of 1997. And like 3 days later, since you had 1.5 day of paternity leave at the time, I was back in work, and this lobbyist called and said, "Well, let's go to lunch." He said, "Congratulations, I understand your baby. Your wife had her baby, so that's great. Let's go to lunch." He goes, "Let's go smoke a cigar." And I said, "Sure, let's go do it." So he went and he bought me a lobbyist lunch at a French restaurant on the Senate side. And at the end of the meal, he literally brought out 2 cigars. And I said, "Rick, I'm sorry." I hate to, I don't smoke, I hate to ruin a fine tobacco product. And he goes, "That's right." He goes, "You're Mormon, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That doesn't surprise me." He says, "I'm not a member of any organized religion, but if I were, I would probably join your church, because every Mormon that I know is one of the most upright and decent and honest human beings.
Wow.
And and that really stuck with me because he was watching us. And so I took that cigar and took it home, and I actually keep it in my sock drawer. My so every morning when I go put on socks, there's that cigar. It reminds me that somebody has been watching me. And the thing's 27 years old. The interesting thing, and I actually asked him. I said, "So who are the other Mormons you know?" And he said, "I know Jack Gerard." Elder Gerard. I mean, he spoke in the
Uh-huh.
last conference, who
Yeah.
was a bishop in our stake here at the time, and he was actually a lobbyist for the mining industry at the time. And Rick
Huh.
and Jack Gerard worked together. So I went to Jack back before he was, a general authority or stake president or anything, and I just said, "Hey, Rick Fenton watches you every day," and he goes, "That's good to know." You know. And so when Elder Gerard gave his talk back in the April conference, he talked about integrity. I mean, I've known him for years because again, he was a stake president. I was called as a bishop, and then when he was called as a regional authority, then I was called to stake presidency. So I've sort of followed behind Jack. That's the same question that Elder Uchtdorf asked Elder Gerard. He asked me about 6 hours later when I was called as a bishop. But this is there anything that you've done that it were to come to light would be an embarrassment to the church? That's sort of a standard question you get asked when you're called. But that rings very true here as a lobbyist for living in DC because the profile and the stakes are so much higher. And I tell my interns that as well. So look, you guys, my name is on this thing. And so I never want to read about you in Roll Call or The Hill. I don't want to have to explain to your mom why you got a tattoo in Washington, D.C. or crap like that. It's my reputation on the line. So it's been really good. There's always been funny instances. I was giving a speech to a huge group of oil and gas executives in Oklahoma last year, and somebody asked me about drinking Mountain Dew. They raised their hand. They raised their hand and said, "I understand you're Mormon, and I understand you're drinking. What were you doing drinking Mountain Dew?" Ironic, right?
Cheers.
I said, "That's a great question." And it was interesting because on the very front row there were 7 oil and gas billionaires sitting right there at the table together. And I said, "Well, that's a great question." I said, "You know how you tell a good Mormon from a bad Mormon? It's by the temperature of the caffeine that we drink." And it just kind of diffuses the thing. But again, I have no reason not to let people know that I'm a member of the church. It's my reputation. Forces me to live up to it. Forces me to remember that people watch me every time I open my sock drawer. So
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Tim, I know you a little bit. So, I know that your story is you grew up, I would call it rural Utah, in a big family. And then, as you're finishing up college at Utah State, you end up moving to Washington, D.C. What was that like for you to go from rural Utah to living in D.C.? How was it different?
yeah, I mean, I grew up on a dairy farm, youngest of 10 kids in western Idaho, right, which is north end
Okay.
of Cache Valley.
Yeah. Where
And
Ezra Taft
my
Benson's
dad,
famously from, right? Is that right?
yeah, he's from Whitney. He's from the metropolis of Whitney,
Okay. Okay.
Harold B. Lee is from a little bit north up in Clifton. So we raised
Okay.
the good pioneer stock up
Yeah.
there, right?
Okay.
Uh, but my wife and I just got married, and I had worked on a campaign. I worked for Bob Bennett's campaign, and I was at Utah State, uh, theoretically finishing up, and she was about ready to finish up, and Senator Bennett offered me a job to come back to Washington. I wasn't ready to graduate yet. I thought I was. So I went and talked to my counsel. It was the first time that I'd ever spoken to her in four or 5 years at Utah State. And she said, "Yeah, you've got enough major credits to graduate with, but you got to take Geology 101 and Spanish 101." So we moved to Washington. I actually went and talked to my counselor, Matt, and I went and talked to my mentor, somebody like you, is my poli sci professor, a guy named Randy Simmons, who's just retired actually. And I said, "Randy, what do I do?" I said, "I got a scholarship, just got married, got a decent job." And he says, "Tim, sometimes in life you've got to take chances. And if you don't take this chance, you'll regret it the rest of your life." So walked out and resigned the student body position, and we packed up and moved 2 months later. We'd been married 3 months, moved to DC, spent all our adult life here.
Huh.
And that's how we ended up here. But, politically, my family, again, from my dad being an Air Force pilot and a dairy farmer and a fourth grade teacher, raised some pretty politically astute members of my family.
Huh.
Got my brother Ted's the senior federal judge in Utah. My brother Chris was a congressman for a long time. Uh, brother-in-law was the adjutant general of the Utah National Guard there, General Tarbett. My other brothers and sisters are pretty active as well. I'm kind of the wink link in the whole thing. That's how we
It
ended up.
sounds like it. I think they're gonna change the welcome sign to your little Idaho town to home of the Stewarts, though. That's
As
what
they
it sounds
should,
like.
dang
Yeah, as they
it.
should, as they should.
But it's been really interesting because my brother Ted he started us out on the political career side of things. He worked for Congressman Jim Hansen when Jim Hansen was first elected in 1980. Went back to January of 81. And Ted was one of the first employees, and I was Jim Hansen's last chief of staff. Ted was his first chief of staff, and I was the last one. And in between Jim's internships and staff positions, there were 22 members of my family who worked for Jim Hansen at one point or another, either as an intern or a junior level staffer or what have you over the course of his 20 years in Congress. And they've all fanned out. It's been really interesting. So I've got nephews who have had very interesting political careers in and of themselves as well. One of the things I'm most proud of is this is bragging. I'm sorry,
It's
Go
okay.
for it.
but there was a time during my brother Chris's congressional career where one of his chief of staff went off to take over the lead of a federal agency, and there is an Obama administration person who we did battle with for years and years, and he's quoted in one of the major publications here in DC saying, "The Stewart Mafia is real, and its tentacles are everywhere." I'm like,
Oh, you gotta get a
right,
T-shirt with that on it.
I won't dissuade you from thinking that. You just go ahead and think that all you want. It's not true, but you think that is. You just think that. So, but it's been
That's
interesting. I've got really good. I got family members who have done some really good public service. Something to be proud of. I think my dad would be proud. Yeah.
so my perception of Washington D.C. wards in the church is that it's different from the other wards in the church. Like you go to church and there are very important political figures in your ward and in your stake. And I wonder what am I right about that? And what is it like having all these important people go to church with you?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a great verb to attach with the important. Okay, and let me sort of build on that because the beauty of the church experience we had in the 30 years we had in the McLean's Virginia stake was there were a lot of people who were in positions of influence, and almost all of them you would never know because they did not treat their church experience like their career, their political, or their career in Washington. They would talk about sort of the great social equalizer. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what we saw in our ward for years and years and years. Uh, it was really interesting. There was a time when I was a bishop, and my young men's president was the number 3 at the FBI. And he after one meeting, and my executive secretary was a retired Marine colonel. And after a ward council meeting once, my young man's president came up to me and said, "Bishop, I got to hand it to you. Of all the wards I've served in, this is by far the one that is the best administered." And I took that as a compliment. That was because my executive secretary is running like a Marine, like a Marine. But that got me thinking, you guys, and it's really true. It's there. I think back here, I never appreciated that there is this embarrassment of riches with regards to how people could fulfill their church callings based on their professional experience. My Relief
Mhm.
Society president ran $1 billion FAA program, for example. That was her job, and so she could, tackle some of the Relief Society challenges, the administrative challenges, so to speak, in her sleep. That was great. But the other thing that was interesting is there are times when I found this is a criticism myself. It was the transactional nature of this. Okay, let's get this done. Let's be efficient. Let's boom, boom, boom. We run ward council meetings in 55 minutes because we're all busy. Boom, boom, boom. And oftentimes the transactional got in the way of the ministerial. And it took me a while to learn that that's not exactly the best way to run it. But I do go back to what my executive secretary, Alan Craig, told me. He said, "You have to understand," he says, "the spirit functions in the first 30 minutes of a meeting. And most of the revelatory experience will take place in that 30 or 45 minutes. And then that's what you need to be listening for doesn't come at hour 4. It comes at minute 40. And I always tried to factor that in is to say, okay, we're going to petition Lord to hear and answer our prayers and help us to make good decisions. And then we'd start going through an agenda versus actually waiting for him to say, here's the revelation I need you to talk about. When I learned that and changed that, that made meetings much, much different. So it's kind of a cool thing, I thought.
So this is something I just started thinking about, so I haven't formulated it really well in my head, but
Oh, good. I can't wait. I love it when Matt starts a sentence like that. Good, good, good. Go
okay.
on.
So if I were just starting out as a realtor in the state of Utah, I would want to move into a ward with $1 million homes, because then those people can become my friends and maybe I can sell their homes. And
A higher commission, right? Oh, that's changed. So
yeah, and I do see some of that at church sometimes, that I'm like, I feel like this person is here because they're trying to build their professional life with the connections they can develop at church. Do you see anything like that that happens in Washington, D.C.?
um, yeah, that's a good question.
Are
I
you
think
sure?
there's
It sounded like a stupid question to me.
well, you know, I imagine, yeah, there's probably that. But I think that's indicative of any ward, regardless of the location, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think that's just the nature and the culture of our church, which is we try and help each other,
Mhm.
and we feel obligated to help each other, and that can sometimes be beneficial, but certainly exploited at the same time. My underlying philosophy is, and I've done this from time to time, where there have been people who have been in between jobs, and you don't want them to have a break in service or employment. So I put friends and people who have some capability under contract at the firm to do some research for a couple months until they're, and that's fine. I'm happy to do that. I've been blessed to be able to have that flexibility. But there's this fundamental principle which we sometimes forget to apply, which is you never hire somebody you can't fire. And so you've got to be careful about doing transactional work at the ward level, at the work level, because if things go sour, you have to end that up at some point,
Yeah,
and that always never ends well. So, you know,
yeah,
Yeah. Which would be, I think, a difficult part of being a bishop and also a person who owns a company. Like, because in a way, you have to look out for those people in two different ways. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
I've always thought that would be a difficult balancing act.
But I think what goes around comes around, and there have been times when, again, there's people who have maybe lost their job on the hill and were looking for something else, and we were able to put them to work, and then they find themselves in a position where 3 years later they're perfectly fine. All of a sudden, you actually have to go knocking on their door for whatever reason, and you want those relationships to be good and cordial, so you don't have to go hat in hand and apologize or feel uncomfortable about that, right?
For sure.
Yeah,
yeah. As you were talking, Tim, I decided, because I've lived in a lot of different wards in a lot of different areas. What ends up happening is people are people, right? Members of the church are members of the church. And as individuals, we kind of place this higher status on a person based on their job, based on their calling. But anytime you know somebody personally who gets called to be a general authority, or maybe gets appointed to a higher position of power, you realize, like, they're all just people. They're just
oh
in
yeah,
different stations of life, but they're all just people.
oh yeah. I mean, I was bishop when Jack Gerard was stake president, and there are times when we didn't necessarily agree on going one direction or another, and but that doesn't
Yeah.
matter. He's Jack
Yep.
is Jack.
Yeah.
I do think though that there's this principle applies to just about anybody, which is regardless of which ward you're in or the locality, the Lord puts you in a position or places you in somewhere in your life so you can be a blessing to somebody else. And it's actually really interesting. I've gone through this interesting exercise where, as a bishop or a member of the stake presidency, as a bishop, it was all okay. Who do I need to take care of? I've got to check that box, check that box. And then when the stake presidency is a little bit different because you're running a minute, frankly, being the second counselor in the stake presidency is a lot like being John in the temple film. Okay. You're there, but you're all, yeah, I'm here. That's great. President Halls take care of this. President Hans take this, and me too, right? And I was, given my tranche of programs to run, and it was about that time when I sort of changed my approach and actually started to pray for a ministering opportunity every day, and actually kept track of it on a habit tracker, which is I've actually ministered. I've actually made somebody's life different. And it just that whether that's actually helping them find a job or if that's just sending them an encouraging text or telling them I appreciate it. But I've changed that since, which is that's one thing to be a minister. But it was after the last conference where I really changed my approach, and I pray that I can be a tender mercy to somebody. Sorry. And it's amazing how the Lord opens up opportunities for you to be just a tender mercy versus a minister versus a transactional thing. And I encourage anybody to take that approach. It's amazing how many people need a tender mercy in their life. And I'm grateful for that learning experience. I wish I would have learned that as a church leader. It would have made a big, big difference, I think. So sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that was great. So, I don't know if I think you might have mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast. So you commute right now back and forth from DC to Utah because you want to raise your kids in Cache Valley. I'm assuming that this is part of the reason you want to raise your kids in Cache Valley. What do you think are some of the advantages or disadvantages of raising kids in Utah versus in Washington, DC?
Well, again, so my three older kids were all raised here in Virginia, raised in the Virginia school system. When COVID happened and the Fairfax County School District changed its approach to how learning took place and then integrated a lot of things that were just at odds with what I believe as a father and as a church member, that was one of the reasons why we got out. It was a really interesting circumstance for us. We'd lived here 30 years. We were driving. It was March 29th, 2021 at 1:30 p.m. We were driving out to the Eastern Shore to start our spring break. And the kids are in the back seat of the car. They got their headphones on. It's quiet. My wife's kind of sitting there with her eyes closed. And when you live outside Utah, when you grow up in Utah and you live outside, you're always culturally figuring out, do we have to go back? Should we go back? What do we do? And we did that. We actually lived in Utah for a year, and then we came back to DC. It's our second stint here. Came back and we've been here 20 plus years. But our kids are at this inflection point where one was getting to graduate from high school and one was just starting high school. And so we're kind of in the very back of our mind saying, well, is this the time to do it? And it was again in the middle of COVID. We're driving and my wife is released Society President of the Ward, and I'd just been released from the stake presidency about a year earlier. And I'm driving, I'm just sitting there quietly, and this voice says to me as loud as I'm talking to you right now, it said, you don't need to worry about selling your house. You and your wife, you and Marcia should take the kids and move out to Utah. And you can commute back and forth, and I will take care of everything else. And I said to Marcia, I kind of woke her up and I said, I think we should move to Utah. And she said, you're right, we probably should. And we made this decision in about 3.5 minutes or 5 miles of driving that after 30 years, we were going to go back to Utah. We'd already had a house there in North Logan. It's the house on the property that I grew up. We bought it years before and never lived in it. And as amazing, we went in that night and I started a spreadsheet, and the things that fell into place within hours of getting us back to Utah. And it was somewhat baffling, because it's not easy to get on an airplane every week. It's not easy to drive from Logan to Salt Lake, get on an airplane, get in on a Friday night at 11 o'clock at night and drive back to Logan. But the difference in my kids culturally is profound. What has happened in the 3 years since we've moved in the school district that I'm in right now is profound. My two younger kids are doing much, much better. And yeah, they like living here. They like coming back here, but they're happy where they're at because I think the Lord's put them there. It's been a really interesting experience for us. So,
What do you think about that, Melissa?
Well, I'm really thrilled to hear that as a teacher in the Cache County School District. So go us.
yeah,
But I couldn't agree more with the way that you've described how life works, right? Sometimes there's certain places that we need to be to interact with people, to make connections, and to learn the things we need to learn. And it's so important to have time in your head to listen to those instructions. Every good decision I've made in my life, and that's been a blessing to my family, has happened in identically the same way. Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting. So 5 days later, after we made that decision, our stake came through a massive ward realignment process, and we were put in a different ward. And my wife was released as Relief Society president. Boom. And then everything else went, and so we moved back to North Logan, to the old ward that I grew up in, where you have some of those old folks who are now in their 80s who didn't like me when I was 8 years old and don't really like me now anyway. So, but you move back into that ward, and there are 80 widows in the ward, in that North Park ward there.
Yeah.
And my wife physically relocated, dropped right back in, gets into everybody's business, just like she was before,
Yeah.
And it was, man, that ward needs Marcia Stewart more than
Yes.
and
Yep.
that's how it is. So
That's the other thing that I really love about the church is the Lord has a way of moving talent where he needs the talent to be. Sometimes it feels like there's this central planning of callings and things like that, but it's because we don't talk enough about the individual inspiration that says now's the time to do this, and then a person goes and does that.
yeah, you went through that yourself,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Kim Clark when I first started at BYU Idaho, and he's like, I have to tell you, because he came from Harvard to BYU Idaho. He's like, I cannot believe the kinds of talent that are coming to BYU Idaho. If I had put on my best recruiter hat, I could not have brought these people to this place. And it's not BYU Idaho. It's not because it's a special place. It's everywhere that you have members of the church all around the world. People are blessed because the Lord is placing people in situations that they otherwise might not have chosen to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going through a sifting process too, as well. But just it's time for a new chapter, is what it is. And I think there'll be times when the Lord presents you, okay, great job, this chapter's over. Let's open up a new one. I need you to
Yeah.
move somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for joining us. You're always an inspiration to me. On the one hand, when I get a little too pompous, you kind of cut me down and say, you're not so awesome as you think you are.
We
But then
need
on other
people
times,
like that, Matt. You need people like that, Matt.
I do. But then on the other hand, when I need some pickup, some feeling good about things, you've always got great stories to lift me up and make me feel better. So
I miss hanging out with you on Saturday mornings, Melissa. We used to be, we used to go do breakfast with the old men. We call it the Postum Club.
that's
I
right.
love it.
And
I love it.
we were sort of the younger guys there, and it was a great group. Miss having you around. I need you to drive down one Saturday morning just for that. All right. So,
Yeah, I'm going to do that, Tim. That's
okay.
great. Hey, well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. It was great being with you.
All right. Hey, listener, catch you again next week.